When you have a lot of scripture to read, you call on a school teacher. They never let you down. All right. So today's story, stories, as you notice, there are two of them, are ones that are probably, again, like most of the ones we've been doing, fairly familiar to most. Not only are they familiar to us, though, but oftentimes when we encounter them, we try to, or are often tempted to, counter them separately. We will oftentimes read the woman's story without reading the Jairus story around it, or vice versa. That, I believe, is a little bit of a mistake. These are designed, this part of the story is designed to be read together, because what we really have is the same thing, the same story, repeating itself twice with two very different people. And the differences between those two people, and actually the similarities between those two people, is a big part of the point. So let's start with Jairus, the one we meet first. First and foremost, we're told a lot about Jairus right at the beginning of the story. First, we are told that his name is Jairus, right? Many of the people, in fact, most of the people who Jesus encounters and has these short little exchanges with, we never learn their names. And it's not really important to the story that his name is Jairus. It doesn't tell us anything about him necessarily, but what it tells us is because we know his name, we know he's important. Anytime in the Bible somebody's given a name, especially like their full proper name, that is a signal to us as the reader that this person is important. They are of high status. They are of high status because somebody thought to remember what their name was. Because if you think about it, all those things that happened in Jesus' life happened sometimes 20 or 30 years before they were ever written down. So for some reason, throughout that time, before the stories were written down and were just shared between people, Jairus' name was preserved through that whole process. Thus, we know he must have been an important person, because why else would you do that? I can barely remember people I met last week, let alone something that randomly happened while I was standing beside Jesus, 30 years before. So we know he's important because we know his name. We also know he's important because we know what he does. He's the head of the synagogue, which meant a little something different back then than it would mean today. Synagogues functioned a little different back then than it did today. And because we're still in the time of the temple, and the temple is where most of the big religious stuff happens. However, communities would want religious things happening around them, so they would still have space for that, and somebody would be in charge of that. And the person who was in charge of it is usually the one who provided it, which means the person who was in charge of it was usually very wealthy, very important, and very well known. So by telling us he's the head of the synagogue, what they're telling us is he is that no doubt wealthy, that he is no doubt important and well known in the community, and we still know his name because he's important in those ways too. So if we are a reader back then, or we're hearing the story back then, we would no doubt be very, very surprised what happens immediately after Jairus is introduced. Because what does Jairus do? He falls at the feet of Jesus. In his place, in his time, in his community, people are usually, no doubt, at the feet of Jairus, not the other way around. So the fact that Jairus enters this scene and immediately does something that nobody else who knew him, and that he's from this place, the people around him knew him and who he was, he did something that nobody would have ever expected him to do, is he immediately fell at the feet of somebody else. And to fall at somebody's feet is, of course, to say, no matter how important I may think I am or be, what I'm saying in this moment, you, Jesus, are more important than I am. This is a very, very surprising thing to do. This is something that no doubt people will talk about and continue to talk about. Did you hear what Jairus did? What is Jairus doing? Why is he embarrassing himself like this? Why is he embarrassing us like this? Jairus is the leader of the community, and as the leader of the community, it is such as if the whole community now is laying at the feet of Jesus. Why is Jairus willing to embarrass himself and us this way? Well, of course, we were immediately told why. And as a father of a 12-year-old daughter, I completely understand. What else would you do? What else could you do in that situation? Outside of that, I don't imagine he ever would have done it, and this story would have gone very, very differently. Most of the other encounters between Jesus and religious leaders, if you notice, go very, very differently. This one was different because Jairus wasn't concerned about what was proper. He wasn't concerned about how he looked. He wasn't concerned about what people would consider embarrassing or not embarrassing. He was motivated by something else. And so he did something very unexpected. So while we're taking care of Jairus, Jesus goes, and after Jesus goes, then of course we get this woman who comes in. Now, this woman has her own problem, and what we would probably call today like a medical problem, but it was 2,000 years ago and things were different. So she comes and she's looking for something too. Now, the problem that the woman has is not only a medical problem, but it's also a social problem. Because when you are in the situation she is, not only is it no doubt unfortunate and uncomfortable and painful and all of those sorts of things, in Jewish culture at the time, she also would have been seen as unclean. The Jews had a lot of rules at the time about what you could do and what you couldn't do. They had a lot of reasons for those rules. And some of those reasons were good and some of those reasons were not so good. But a lot of their rules actually had to do with hygiene. And in fact, the Jews, with a lot of their practices about hand washing and when you're supposed to do and when you're not supposed to do that, were extensively done for religious purposes. But actually, if you look at what it is they were practically doing, one of the things they were basically practicing doing is teaching each other what we try to teach our children to do, which is basically wash your hands before you eat anything, right? Wash your hands after you use the bathroom, right? I mean, all those things we try to drill into the head of our kids, those were actually not common practices at the time. The Jews were actually seen as a bit strange for having done it and continuing to do it. So one of the many reasons they did the things they did, even though they probably didn't know that's why they were doing it, because they didn't even know what a germ was a lot of what they're doing is practicing hygiene. And there was this concern, that basically if something was going on in your life or you were in a situation where you were unclean, if you were to touch anybody else, they would become unclean too, basically first century cooties. Okay, good, we're awake. All right, got it. And so that was this woman's situation. And unfortunately, we hear that not only is it unfortunately for her, it wasn't a temporary situation, it had been a fairly permanent situation for a long time. And imagine what that would be and how inconvenient life would be if you were constantly considered unclean, constantly considered to be someone who shouldn't be around other people, shouldn't be touching other people, shouldn't be living near other people, because God didn't want you to. That was this woman's life. So first and foremost, the fact that she's even there amongst a crowd is a problem. She's from the area, so people no doubt she's from the area, so people no doubt know who she is. That creates a problem too. And she, just like Jairus, is putting herself in not only a potential embarrassing situation, but she is actually putting herself in a situation that could in fact be dangerous for her, depending on how the people around her react. So when she reaches out to touch Jesus' clothes, she's looking for something. She's looking for healing. She's looking for help. She's looking for support. And she's running a very big risk because she doesn't know what Jesus is going to do. And the reader, the first time through, wouldn't know either. The expectation would be when Jesus starts looking around, well, who is it that touched me? It would have been completely fair, completely reasonable, and the response that people would have expected in that moment would have been for Jesus to berate that woman and say, why did you make me unclean? But of course, that's not what Jesus did. Jesus did something very different. One of the things that always strikes me about the healing miracles is there is no consistency in the mechanics of them, meaning that Jesus heals people in all sorts of ways in all sorts of places. Sometimes without touching them, sometimes by touching them, one time by spitting on the ground and making mud with his hands and rubbing it in the dude's eyes, which, I mean, I guess if you're desperate, sure. And I think that the lesson we take from that is the mechanics of what Jesus did isn't the point, right? The mechanics of what Jesus did isn't the point. The point is what Jesus tells us the point is, which is it wasn't actually even Jesus' robe that healed the woman. It was the fact that she believed Jesus could do it. It was the faith of Jairus that helped restore his daughter. Now, as a side note, I always thought it was really, really nice that the first thing Jesus said is, would somebody please get this teenager a snack? Because, but actually, there's actually a little bit of a point behind that, because at the time, one of the things that was absolutely understood is that ghosts don't eat. So if you eat something, then you're not a ghost. They apparently never saw Ghostbusters, which I suppose is fair. We have two amazing stories of people doing things they absolutely 100% shouldn't do, that should lead them to, if nothing else, feel a lot of embarrassment, and if nothing, or even sometimes things even worse, that could have turned out very, very differently, that no doubt people in the community struggled with and weren't sure how to respond to, but they were motivated by something important. Jairus was motivated by the love of his daughter, and the woman was motivated by the love for herself, and that was fine. We talk in this church all the time that we're called to love God, love neighbor, and love ourselves. The woman was willing to step up and step through because she knew she needed something, and she believed with her whole heart that Jesus could do it. When we believe in something and know there's something we're supposed to do, and especially if that thing that we are supposed to do is love somebody, it's amazing what we suddenly find ourselves able and willing to do, things that maybe we otherwise never would have thought about. All right. So my daughter is at that age, well, she's 12, as I told you. She's at that age where she's kind of, learning about and discovering about herself. And now, of course, we have this thing called the internet, which is so wonderful. And one of the things that my daughter has discovered is online personality tests. I'm like, sure, whatever. Which Hogwarts house are you? I don't know. Actually, I do, but it's fine. You wouldn't be surprised. Probably you would, actually. Anyway, so she took one the other day, and it was sort of the classic kind of Myers-Briggs kind of test, and so she got her 4 letters and all that sort of stuff. And she's like, Dad, you know what you are? And I'm like, yeah, I have, taken those along. And so I run through it, and she looks at me, and she's like, you're an introvert? And I'm like, yes. And I think we live in a world that actually somewhat misunderstands introverts and who we are, because we get like little memes like this. I always like this. Introverts unite separately in your own homes. And she's like, but Dad, I know, but you're up there and you talk about people. I'm like, yes, and I love being up here. Quite honestly, I love being up here. I love talking to you all. I love hanging out with Cookie Fellowship afterwards. I hope the thing's nice and filled up by now. I like meeting with you all. I like talking with people. I just do all that stuff and I have a really good time, and then I go home and take a nap. Because that's what introverts do. Extroverts go and like weed their garden or something. I don't know what you folks do. But the Sunday afternoon nap is a holy and sacred thing. And I think sometimes we do folks a disservice when and we always do ourselves a disservice anytime we try to put people in boxes. But I think we do this. I think we can make assumptions about ourselves, and people can make assumptions about us. Now, it was not always the case that I was willing to be the one in front, right? I mean, not only am I also an introvert, I come by it honestly because I'm also a middle child, right? And I'm a middle child of a sister. My sister was 2 years older than me, and actually pretty popular in school. So the 2 years that we were in high school together at the same time was just fantastic. Because everybody wants to be the overweight little brother of the popular girl. Super fun. And so I kind of, I found my own way, and I found my own path, and I found my own little group of people. I mean, I've told you before, I was in Future Homemakers of America because they got to hang out in the home ec room where all the cooking stuff was. Super fun. And so I did a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff and stuff like that until my junior year. In my junior year, when my sister was out of the school, I was taking my government class, and my government teacher came to me and said, hey, have you thought about joining the speech and drama team? And then I laughed at her. And then I realized that was probably inappropriate and apologized. And I'm like, well, not really. What does that look like? And in Montana, they do speech and drama a little differently than I think they do most places, because it's together, because, we're small. And so she starts listing off these events, like, well, we have this one called oratory, where you prepare a speech and then you read the speech. And I'm like, I don't read well. And I don't. There's a reason that I don't read my sermons. You wouldn't like it. It doesn't go well. And so I'm like, nah, it doesn't sound like fun. She's like, okay, well, we have another event. We have humorous events where you get up and you do something funny. And I'm like, well, I'm not funny. Oh, really? Dang. Now the truth comes out. All right. And I'm like, okay. And then she's like, well, then we have this other event called extemporaneous speaking. And basically you get a topic and then you get 30 minutes to go research the topic. And then you go and give a 5 to 6 minute speech about it. And I'm like, okay. So that basically is they give you something to talk about and then you go BS for a little while. I'm like, I could do that. That feels like my skill set. And she's like, okay. But here's the thing. We only have 2 slots for each of these events, and we have one person who is in the event now, and one person that's thinking of moving to a different event. And so I'll need to check with her first. And she tells me who this person is, and I don't recognize the name. I'm like, I don't know who that is. And I'm like, oh, you wouldn't know her, she's new. I'm like, oh, new girl. I wouldn't mind meeting the new girl. So later on, I almost that day or the day after, I run into her again, the teacher again, down in the photocopy room, and she's like, oh, I'm glad you're here. That the other person who was doing the event is here too, and it turns out she's not going to do it. And oh, by the way, have you met Dane? For those who don't know, that's my wife. And I'm like, I have not. Nice to meet you, new girl. It took a little while. Anyway. And I will tell you, being part of that event and being part of that thing, I learned something. I learned something about myself. I learned that I could stand in front of people. And I learned that I would just sort of nap on the bus on the way home. And that was okay. But it was hard to get past that initial moment of going, I don't know that I can do that. I don't know that I can stand in front of people. I don't know if I have the ability to do that. What if I look silly? And what I was told over and over again is this is a very supportive environment. You're going to be in a small room. There's only going to be a few people around. The judges are all very nice. There are other parents too. No one's going to make fun of you. And I'm like, okay. But there was still that barrier to get over. Like, I don't know. Is this for me? Turns out it's for me. And you can make a career out of it. Who knew? Sometimes we need that little push, that little ability. That wanting, that desire to not only be in front of everybody, but to have a time and excuse to hang out a little bit with the new girl. Very motivating. And when we can overcome that embarrassment, we can overcome those sorts of things, sometimes we not only discover something about the world, we can discover something about ourselves. For some of us, that's a high bar, right? No, I don't think anybody likes feeling embarrassed. Some of us probably have tried to avoid it more than others. But it is a barrier, no doubt, for most of us. Okay, fast forward a few years, many years, in fact. Summer of 2006, I'm at home. I'm packing up because we are preparing to move from our house of Albuquerque and move to Ohio for seminary. We decided to make this big change in life, and we were going to go for it. I've got the news on in the background because that's what you did before you just walked around listening to podcasts and things like that all day, right? You'd have the cable news on, and the cable news is on in the background. And the story comes on, and the story is that the mascot for the Chicago Bulls had been arrested for assaulting a sheriff's officer. This caught my attention. Not because I am a Chicago Bulls fan. In fact, I've at that point never been to Chicago. Not because I care about basketball, because I do not care about basketball. I'm sorry. Sorry. I mean, go Riders. Professional basketball. Didn't care about any of that. What perked my interest was the fact that it was Benny the Bull. Because what I knew in that moment was that the person who was currently Benny the Bull, before that, had been Monty, the mascot for the University of Montana, which, as many of you know, is the wrong school. But he had been the mascot Monty, and he was actually recruited, because apparently they do this, out of the school after he graduated to go be the mascot for the Bulls. And he was well known as Monty, and he for being very athletic and being a mascot in a way that is not often common in especially college sports. Now, I knew that he was Monty before he was Benny, because before he was Monty, he was Barry, and Barry lived across the alley from Dane. They may have dated for a short time, but we don't talk about that. And not only did he live across the state, not only did he live across the alley from Dane, he was also another member of the speech and drama team with us at the same time. He was in the same class as Dane was, and you're not going to believe what his event was. He was a mime. Makes all the sense. Well, hold on. You did a pretty good job actually keeping quiet this whole time. I'm actually really impressed. Thank you. That was my wife, FYI, for those watching at home. Anyway, yes. So, and actually, my senior year and his junior year, he was actually a state champion mime. And of course, somehow he found a way to make a career out of that too. Who knew? But not only was he a state champion mime, Barry was one of those guys who just never seemed to ever actually feel embarrassment. Right? There are too many stories. I don't really have his permission to tell them anyway, so I'm not going to, but trust me, there are plenty of stories of Barry finding himself in interesting situations and laughing about it the whole time. One of the things that I appreciated in my time and my experience being around him and around people like that, and I've encountered others throughout my life, is they're a wonderful living example of the idea of what's the worst that could happen, right? Yes, he would do things, that most of us would look at and go, man, I'm not sure I would have done that. But he always seemed to be having a good time. Never seemed to imagine himself seriously hurt. And because of that, he had opened himself up to opportunities, and he'd opened himself up to do things, and he'd opened himself up to bring joy and laughter, because if you ever really wanted to get a good laugh, you would just spend a little time with Barry and you would feel better. You wanted to be near him on the bus because you knew it would be a zany time, unless you were tired and then you didn't want to be near him on the bus. Barry was consistent, and Barry brought joy wherever it is that he went, because he was not worried about being embarrassed. He was far more concerned about entertaining. Fast forward again, another number of years. And for most of you, if you were here, I arrived at this church in August, which means that I missed VBS that summer. And so that following year, in the spring, when it started to be time for VBS again, I went to Carrie Ann. I was like, do I have any responsibilities? Like, what do you expect me to do for VBS? And she's like, well, before you came, the pastor and Kimberly used to do the skits together. But since you weren't here, Kimberly and Amy Sassano did the skits together, and they really enjoyed it. So I think they would like to keep doing it. And I'm thinking, that sounds great. They should keep doing that. And then she's like, okay, well, why don't you take the pictures? And I'm like, fantastic. So, because I love children, I love them very much, but I got to tell you, the thing I sometimes have about kids is they are not into odd stories from the Bible or deep dives into Greek syntax. Not the way that you all are. Right? So sometimes kids are a struggle for me. So I'm like, oh, great, if other people want to do it, that's fine. And then, of course, that first year that I was here for VBS, I got the opportunity to watch Kimberly and Amy do their skits together, at which point I fell down on my knees and thanked the Lord Jesus I didn't have to do it. Because if you have not been here for a skit, some day in VBS this summer, come in the morning and just watch the skits. You will smile the rest of the day. And I've thought, as far as I've come in my life, and as much as I don't think I'm someone who is really scared of much, when you watch these two amazing people lay it all out here on the stage, and the kids are laughing and having a good time, I think, oh my gosh, those are the right two people to do that. They don't care about what the adults are thinking in this moment, other than all we are thinking is, you go. They are 100% committed to what they are doing, and what they are trying to do is not just entertain the kids. We don't just entertain kids at VBS. But they know, and what they figured out is that if you want to get through to kids, being willing to be the way that you all tend to be is a great way to do it, because they're paying attention. The kids' eyes are locked on them the whole time. They're looking forward to it. They're looking forward to a story that teaches them about God and Jesus, the Holy Spirit, are called to love each other and all those other things that we work so hard to put into the heads of our children. They look forward to it because Amy and Kimberly are not worrying about, what may or may not look embarrassing, very clearly. And are instead worried about what's going to get through to these kids. How do we love on them? How do we have them have a good experience so they want to come back so we can love on them some more? That is the most important thing at the moment. Jairus is willing to do what he did because he loved his daughter. The woman was willing to do what she did because she loved himself. Kimberly and Amy are willing to do what they did because they love the kids. We are called to love God, neighbor, and self, but not just when it's convenient and not just when it's easy. The idea of loving God and loving yourself sounds easy, but if we really dig into it and we take the stories of the Bible seriously, we realize that it actually is not. Because not only are we called to do it, we are called to do whatever we need to, whatever we can do to love God, love neighbor, and love ourselves. And sometimes that may mean putting ourselves out there. Sometimes that may be doing something. Sometimes that may mean taking a risk. Sometimes that may be allowing ourselves to potentially look a little foolish. Sometimes that's specifically what God wants us to do, because in that place, in that moment, that's what is needed so that we can live the mission that we have. We are blessed constantly and continually by those who are willing to do that work. We are called to do the same for others. We are blessed routinely in this church by all of those who are willing to come up and stand in front. Every time we welcome a nervous youth to share their musical gift, they are taking a risk, but they are willing to do it because we have created a space and a place where they feel safe to do it, at least enough to try. We are called to take the risks ourselves and to provide space for others. And when we do that, we are truly blessed continually and constantly. Because at the end of the day, while I do think that I did find a way to be a little bit humorous, I don't know that I'm quite able to tell jokes in the way that the person sitting over here is able to do it. And I have an example.
I'm going to go. But before I do you guys want to hear a super fantastic, ultra awesome hyena joke? Okay. What do you call it when a hyena can do something that a human can't?
I don't know. What do you call it when a hyena can do something a human can't?
It means it's possible.
Oh, you were good.
All right, see you later.
All right, see you later, Harry.